The Grand Archive of the Galactic Empire occupied an entire moon. Not a small moon, not a hollowed-out asteroid dressed up with a name. A proper moon 1.4 times the diameter of the planet it orbited, with a gravitational pull sufficient to keep its own thin atmosphere pinned to its surface like a wool blanket on a sleeping child. Every wall, every corridor, every subbasement carved into its mantle hummed with data, census records, star charts, weapons classifications, species indexes, diplomatic treaties stretching back 10,000 years in 17 different scripts. Grand Archivist Velthara had overseen it all for 63 years. She was a Velhani, long-limbed, silver-skinned, with 6 fingers on each hand that moved across data slates with the practiced grace of a concert musician. She had cataloged 3 new species during her tenure, updated the threat assessments of 11 others, and personally overwritten 2 erroneous entries that had almost caused interstellar wars. She was, by any measure, the most meticulous mind in the Empire's administrative apparatus. She believed, genuinely and without arrogance, that the archive was complete. Not perfect. Completeness and perfection were different things, and Velthara was too old for perfectionism. But complete, yes. Every spacefaring species known to exist in the charted galaxy had an entry, every inhabited world of note, every weapon system that had ever punched a hole in an Imperial hull. The galaxy was vast, but it was not infinite, and the Empire had been mapping it for 10 millennia. There was comfort in that. Order was comfort, knowing was comfort. Which was why, on a quiet administrative morning in the 9847th year of Imperial record-keeping, the message from junior analyst Pravik landed on her desk like a stone dropped into still water. The message was brief. Pravik was not a dramatic individual. She had reviewed his personnel file twice, once when he was hired, once when she found a categorization error in his third-month intake reports. He had a flat, methodical writing style that Velthara had always appreciated. The message read, Anomalous sensor flag Sector 7 Theta, Spiral Arm Designation Orion. Signal pattern does not match any logged profile in the weapons index. Flagging for review. Analyst Pravik. Attached was a single sensor readout. A pulse of energy that moved between stars in a way that did not conform to any known drive signature in the archive's 942 entry propulsion database. Velthara stared at it for a long time. Then she filed it. The galaxy was vast, and sensor drift was a known phenomenon, and junior analyst Pravik, for all his methodical virtues, had only been with the archive for 11 months. Unknown signals in the outer spiral arms were almost always instrument noise, almost always debris, almost always nothing. She filed it under Unconfirmed Atmospheric Interference Review Pending. She moved on to her next item. Later, much later, she would return to that decision and sit with it in the dark of her private quarters, staring at the ceiling, replaying that morning with the specific and excruciating clarity that only regret can produce. She would think about the word almost, about how 11 months of experience was sometimes exactly the right amount to see something that 63 years of certainty had made invisible. She would think about Pravik's flat, methodical prose and the fact that he had been correct, and she had not believed him, and 12 warships had paid for that. But that morning, she filed it and moved on. The archive hummed around her, complete and orderly and utterly, catastrophically wrong. Admiral Sethvaras commanded 12 ships and had never lost one. This was not luck. The Empire did not promote through luck. It was competence, precision, and an instinct for threat assessment so finely tuned that his senior staff sometimes joked he could smell danger before the sensors picked it up. He had served in the Outer Rim suppression, the Cathali border disputes, and the 3-year standoff at the Draven Passage that had ended without a single shot fired because Sethvaras had positioned his fleet with such cold geometric perfection that the opposing admiral simply backed down rather than commit to mathematics that guaranteed his destruction. 12 ships, 17 years of command, 0 losses. He reviewed the mission briefing for Sector 7 Theta with the same calm attention he gave everything. Patrol assignment. 1 reported anomalous signal, probable instrument drift. Destination. A small, unremarkable world in the third orbital position of a yellow dwarf star. Survey designation Sol III. Listed status. Pre-spaceflight civilization, non-aggressive, non-threat. Last survey contact, 412 years prior. Routine, completely routine. He brought his fleet out of fold space at 600 standard hours and immediately noticed 3 things. The first was that there were structures in orbit around Sol III. Many structures, far more than a pre-spaceflight civilization should have managed in 4 centuries. Metallic, angular, some of them moving. The second was that several of those structures appeared to be accelerating toward his fleet. The third was that his weapons officer, a Velhani veteran of 20 years named Thessar, had gone completely silent in a way that Seth Varas had never heard from her before. Not the silence of calm assessment, but the silence of a person whose brain has briefly refused to process what their eyes are reporting. "Thessar," he said. "They're not in the weapons index," she said. "The drive signatures, the energy outputs, none of it matches anything in the database." Classification. "I can't classify them. There's no category." Seth Varas opened a fleet-wide channel and began standard first contact hailing protocols. The universal greeting pattern the Empire used for species that might not understand language. A mathematically ordered sequence of pulses that communicated peaceful intent across any communication barrier. The response came 12 seconds later. It was not a mathematical sequence. It was a projectile, moving at a velocity that the targeting computer took 3 attempts to confirm because the number seemed physically unreasonable. It hit the forward shields of the INS Prevailing Order, the lead ship, and the shields held, but only barely, and the energy discharge from the impact was sufficient to fuse 3 secondary conduits and knock the navigation array offline for 40 seconds. 40 seconds in a space engagement is a very long time. The next 18 minutes were the worst of Seth Varas's career. He made every correct decision. He pulled the fleet into a defensive formation, returned fire with precision, kept his commanders calm and coordinated, bought time for a transmission burst to Imperial Command. His crews performed flawlessly. His tactics were textbook. None of it mattered. They kept coming. Wave after wave of the small, crude, implausibly fast vessels from the blue-green world, and they did not move like military craft. They moved like something that had learned strategy not in an academy, but in the raw, grinding chaos of actual war, in the actual dark of space, over actual decades of fighting and failing and adapting, until what remained was something that no clean military classification could contain. The last thing Seth Varas transmitted was 34 seconds of raw sensor data. And then, with the precise elocution of a man who had spent his entire adult life choosing his words carefully, 4 words. "It is not afraid." Then the transmission ended. And Battle Group Dominion 7 was gone. Velthara pulled the Sol III entry herself. She did not delegate it. After the emergency briefing, 12 ships, no survivors, no wreckage recovered, just debris and silence, and a sensor log that the War Council's analysts had watched 11 times without reaching consensus on what they were seeing. She returned to the archive alone and pulled the file personally, standing at her desk in the early hours of the station's sleep cycle, while the rest of the moon hummed quietly around her. The entry was there. Of course it was. The archive had entries for every cataloged world in the charted galaxy. Sol III, third planetary body, Sol system, Sector 7 Theta, Orion arm designation, yellow dwarf primary star, nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, carbon-based biosphere, 1 large natural satellite. She read the species assessment. It had been compiled 412 years ago by Survey Team Aurelian 9, a standard 7-person expedition of the kind the Empire dispatched to promising but pre-spaceflight worlds every few decades, checking development progress, updating threat assessments, flagging anything that warranted attention. The report was detailed, and thorough. Survey Team Aurelian 9 had been professional. They had documented the species' biology, its social structures, its territorial conflicts, its technological level. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, average lifespan 60 to 80 years without medical intervention, highly tribal, prone to intraspecies warfare, iron smelting technology, early firearms, crude, powder-based propellant systems. Estimated timeline to basic atmospheric spaceflight, 800 to 1200 years, assuming continued technological development, and provided the species did not collapse due to its apparent appetite for self-destruction. Threat classification: none, non-spacefaring, non-contact protocol in effect. And then the entry stopped. Not concluded, stopped. There was no closing assessment, no updated contact schedule, no follow-up survey date. The file simply ended mid-development, as if Survey Team Aurelian 9 had simply ceased to exist mid-sentence. No completion report, no extraction record, no signal that they had ever returned from Sol III at all. Velthara cross-referenced the team's personnel records. 7 names, 7 complete service histories up to the date of deployment, and then nothing, no reassignment, no retirement, no death notices, no record of return. She sat down slowly in her chair. 412 years ago, a survey team had gone to the blue-green world and had not come back, and in the totality of the Grand Archive, in 10,000 years of meticulous record-keeping, nobody had noticed. The incomplete entry had sat in the catalog like a missing tooth in a smile, present enough to look whole at a glance, absent enough to matter enormously up close. And in those 400 years, the species with iron tools and powder-based firearms had apparently done something. She did not yet know what, but she was beginning to understand, with the specific cold clarity that comes to very methodical people when their system has catastrophically failed, that the answer was going to change everything. She flagged the file, priority review, immediate escalation. Then she sat in the dark and breathed and thought about a survey team that had gone silent, and a signal that a junior analyst had flagged as atmospheric drift, and 12 warships that were no longer anywhere at all. Grand Admiral Sorvax was not a man who panicked. He had the build of someone who had been born to project calm authority, broad-shouldered for a Cathali, with deep-set amber eyes that his subordinates described, not always charitably, as resembling a predator that had never personally experienced being prey. He had served the Empire for 40 years. He had put down rebellions, enforced blockades, and overseen the orbital bombardment of 2 worlds that had refused imperial treaty terms. He was not sentimental about force. He understood it the way a craftsman understands tools, as a thing with the right application for every problem. 12 lost ships was not a crisis. 12 lost ships was a problem with a solution, and the solution was more ships. The War Council approved his proposal in 40 minutes. An armada of 40 vessels, 3 full battle groups, including 6 of the Empire's most advanced heavy cruisers, dispatched to Sol III with orders to assess, suppress, and if necessary pacify. 40 ships could crack a moon. Against a pre-space flight world that had somehow gotten ambitious, 40 ships was not a response. It was an announcement. Sorvax composed the formal surrender demand personally. He broadcast it on all open frequencies in the direction of Sol III in 17 galactic languages, because the Empire was civilized and because he genuinely expected this to end at the negotiating table. Some species got aggressive when startled. He had dealt with that before. You arrived with overwhelming force, you made the scope of the situation clear, and they surrendered. Standard procedure. He gave them 6 hours to respond. They responded in 4, not by communication channel, but by action. What happened in the next 18 minutes would be studied by imperial military analysts for generations, not because it was elegant. It was not elegant, but because it was effective in a way that defied every established model of how a species at this developmental stage should fight. There was no coordinated fleet doctrine. There was no unified command structure that the Empire's signal intercept teams could identify. The vessels that engaged Sorvax's armada came from multiple approach vectors simultaneously, in multiple waves, using multiple different weapon systems, as if they had been assembled from whatever was available rather than built to a standard. Some of them were military craft, purpose-built warships with recognizable weapons hardpoints and structured formation discipline. But others, the Empire's analysts would spend months on this, others were clearly not. One vessel that disabled a heavy cruiser's primary drive had a hull profile consistent with commercial freight transport. Another that coordinated a flanking strike with 3 other ships appeared, from its energy signature, to be running a reactor designed for atmospheric mining operations. One of the most effective attack craft in the entire engagement was broadcasting, on a frequency it apparently hadn't realized was still open, what sounded like music. 17 of Sorvax's 40 ships were disabled in under 6 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Drive systems crippled, weapons arrays fused, navigation offline. The humans, apparently, were not interested in killing when they could simply stop you from moving. Sorvax sat on his bridge and looked at his readouts, and did not speak for a very long time. He had brought a hammer. The problem had not behaved like a nail. He pulled his remaining fleet back and transmitted his report to the War Council in a flat, clipped tone that his staff had never heard from him before. The tone of a man recalibrating every assumption he had walked into a room with. "Request strategic consultation," he said. "This is not a suppression scenario." Intelligence Directorate retrieved the original survey team's final complete report from deep archive storage and brought it to an emergency session of the War Council. The report was 412 years old. It smelled of age, not literally, because digital files do not smell, but there was something in its phrasing, in the slightly archaic syntax of the translation algorithms of that era, that made it feel ancient. A document from another time, describing a world that no longer existed in the form it had been observed. The lead analyst, a sharp-featured Draven named Korath who had spent 20 years in threat assessment, read the key passages aloud. Iron tools, powder-based projectile weapons, interspecies conflict on a near-constant basis across multiple territorial factions, social organization fragmented, tribal, competitive. Estimated probability of species survival to spaceflight capability, 31%, contingent on resolution of the species' documented tendency toward large-scale self-destructive conflict. 31%. Korath set down the report and looked at the War Council. The War Council looked back at him. "Run the projections," the First Minister said. They had already run the projections. They ran them again. The projections kept returning the same answer, phrased in the patient, indifferent language of actuarial mathematics. In 400 years, the species-designated Sol III native had industrialized, developed electrical power systems, split the atom, constructed a global communications network, placed itself into orbit around its own world, walked on its natural satellite, deployed robotic probes to the edges of its solar system, and then, quietly, without fanfare, without any signal the Empire had detected, extended itself into interstellar space. At the point of first contact, the species had been spacefaring for approximately 60 years. 60 years. The Empire had required 2,000 years to develop the fold drive. The Cathali, the fastest developers in recorded galactic history, had managed it in 800. The humans, starting from iron tools, had compressed the entire arc of technological civilizational development into a timeline that the War Council's analysts initially refused to enter into the model, because it returned an error suggesting the input values were corrupted. They were at 31% probability of survival, Korath said, unnecessarily, because everyone in the room had heard him the first time. We assumed they would collapse. We had good reason to assume they would collapse. By every metric we apply to developing species, they should have collapsed. Why didn't they? The First Minister asked. Korath was quiet for a moment. He was a precise man who did not like imprecise answers, and the answer he had arrived at was frustratingly imprecise. Because, he said finally, they kept choosing not to. The room was silent. It wasn't a satisfying answer. It wasn't a strategic analysis or a threat vector assessment. It was almost embarrassingly simple, but the data kept coming back to the same place. Every time the species had reached a threshold that should have ended them, every plague, every global conflict, every ecological crisis, every moment when the mathematics of their situation pointed clearly toward extinction, they had made another choice. Not always the right choice, not always a good choice, but another choice, and then another after that. 31% probability of survival. And they had survived. And then they had gotten annoyed at the Empire for showing up uninvited. The captured flight recorder arrived at the War Council in a sealed case, recovered from one of the disabled human vessels by an Imperial salvage team that had approached the wreck very carefully with shields raised and weapons charged and found, to their considerable unease, that nobody tried to stop them. The humans had apparently left it on purpose. Velthara was present for the decoding session, sitting in the back of the room, saying nothing, watching everything. She had been present for most of the War Council's emergency sessions since Dominion 7's loss, a quiet silver-skinned presence that nobody asked to leave because she was the Grand Archivist, and her clearance outranked everyone in the room except the First Minister. And the First Minister had stopped arguing with her about anything approximately 36 hours ago. The flight recorder contained navigational logs, weapons system data, communication records, and something that took the analysts 3 hours to properly categorize, because there was no existing category for it. A running commentary from the crew, informal, unstructured, clearly never intended for anyone outside the vessel, in which 11 human beings described what they were doing, and why in a way that sounded less like a military operation than like a group of people who had decided together that something needed to be done and had gone to do it. They had not been ordered to engage the Imperial Armada. They had watched Dominion 7's engagement on long-range sensors from their position in the outer system, had apparently argued about it for approximately 40 minutes in a manner that the translation algorithm struggled to fully render because it involved a great deal of profanity, and had then voted. Voted. By a margin of 8-3, the crew of what the hull registration identified as a civilian deep space hauler, named the Borrowed Time, had decided that the things that had shown up near their homeworld needed to be discouraged from further visits, and they had converted their cargo bay magnetic accelerators into improvised weapons systems over the course of several hours while still traveling toward the engagement. And then they had joined a battle against the most powerful military force in the charted galaxy, because they felt it was the right thing to do. The analyst presenting the data stopped speaking and looked at the War Council. There are hundreds of vessels like this in the engagement record, he said. Corporate haulers, research vessels, retired military craft that individual humans purchased after their nations decommissioned them. One vessel appears to be operated by an institution of learning. There is no unified command, no central strategy. Individual human factions have been coordinating via a communications network, but it is decentralized. There is no single point we could target to disrupt it. The First Minister leaned forward. What is their actual military fleet doing? Also fighting, the analyst said, but their actual military fleet accounts for less than 40% of the vessels engaged against us. The rest are, he paused, searching for the correct term, volunteers. Velthara, from the back of the room, spoke for the first time in 6 hours. We planned for an army, she said. We encountered a species that treats war as a communal activity. Nobody responded because there was nothing useful to say. The War Council convened a full emergency session on the 43rd day after first contact. The agenda was simple and terrible. What to do next? On one side of the debate stood Sorvax, whose damaged pride and damaged fleet had calcified into a conviction that the correct response was escalation. More ships, heavier weapons, a show of force sufficient to make the mathematics of the situation undeniable to even the most stubborn human faction. On the other side stood Velthara, who had submitted a 14,000-word analysis arguing for a ceasefire overture, and had spent the intervening days watching the War Council's members read it with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright indignation. The Empire did not issue ceasefire overtures to pre-spaceflight civilizations. Velthara's response to this objection, delivered with the precise patience of someone who had been managing institutional resistance for 63 years, was that Sol III was not a pre-spaceflight civilization, had not been a pre-spaceflight civilization for 60 years, and perhaps the War Council would benefit from updating its framework accordingly. The debate had reached its third and most heated hour when the new transmission arrived. Not military communication, not weapons fire, a data packet addressed with specificity that made the communications officer visibly uncomfortable, not to the War Council, not to the Imperial military, but to the Grand Archive. To Velthara personally, by name, in a form of address that suggested whoever had sent it had done enough research into imperial administrative structure to know exactly who oversaw the catalog of known species. Velthara opened it at the session table, under every eye in the room. It contained two things. The first was a star chart, human explored space, mapped in detail that was not an estimate or an approximation but a genuine, surveyed, verified cartographic record. It covered 3 times the territory that the Empire's survey estimates had projected. Every system, every body of interest, annotated in a format that, and this was what silenced the room, was compatible with Imperial Archive standards, as if whoever compiled it had studied the Archive's own filing conventions and deliberately matched them. The second was a message. It was written in 17 galactic languages. Good ones, not the halting machine-translated syntax of a species using an algorithm. These were the translations of people who had spent time learning how those languages actually worked, who understood nuance and register, and the difference between a formal address and an informal one. 17 languages, all saying the same thing. We have been here, we have been watching. We are not in your records because we chose not to introduce ourselves. You chose differently. Let us talk. Sorvex opened his mouth. Velthara looked at him. Just looked. And whatever he saw in her expression, the 63 years of it, the 12 ships of it, the 40 disabled cruisers of it, the survey team that had gone silent 400 years ago of it, closed his mouth again. We will respond, Velthara said, to the room and to no one in particular, to the communication. Negotiations took 2 years. Not because they were contentious, though they were, frequently, in the specific way that conversations between two parties who have already shot at each other tend to be contentious, but because they were careful. Both sides were careful. The humans sent representatives who asked very precise questions and took very detailed notes and never agreed to anything without consulting a process they called, with a translation that the Archive's algorithm rendered as approximately checking with the people back home, which was apparently not a formality, but a genuine mechanism by which their disparate factions maintained buy-in to the outcome. It was inefficient by imperial standards. It was also, Velthara observed in her private journal, extremely effective. She attended every session. She was not required to, her role was administrative, not diplomatic, but the First Minister had stopped questioning her presence after the first week when it became clear that she was the most useful person in the room. She had read everything the archive contained about the humans, and she had filled the considerable gaps in that record over the 2 years of negotiation, and she had developed what she could only describe as a specific form of respect for the people across the table. Not admiration, not fear. Respect, the kind earned by watching something work in a way you did not expect and adjusting your expectations accordingly. She sat with the survey team Aurelian 9 question for most of the first year. It was not on the negotiating agenda. It was ancient history, technically, and neither side had raised it. But Velthara raised it herself, privately, with the senior human representative, a small, gray-haired woman named Dr. Amara Os, who had the unhurried manner of someone who had been having difficult conversations for a very long time. Dr. Os I had listened to the question, considered it for a moment, and then spoken carefully. "We found them," she said. "The survey team. About 380 years ago, they'd been on the surface for about 30 years by then, living with a community in what we now call Ghana. They didn't want to leave. Velthara absorbed this, and you allowed that." They asked. We weren't really in a position to argue with people who'd been there longer than most of our nations had existed. A pause. "Their descendants are still there. Some of them are in the diplomatic corps now. They applied specifically for the Imperial contact assignment." Velthara thought about that for a long time. On the final day of the second year, when the preliminary accord was signed, and the initial framework for formal relations between the Galactic Empire and the human-designated United Earth Compact was entered into the record, Velthara returned to the archive alone and opened the Sol III entry. She stared at the old assessment for a long time, bipedal, non-threat, estimated to collapse. Then she began to write. She did not use the standard format. She had never done that before. The archive had conventions for a reason, and she had enforced them for 63 years. But the standard format did not have a field for what she wanted to say, so she created one. A personal annotation, the first in 10,000 years of imperial record-keeping. She wrote, "Do not underestimate this species. They are not dangerous because they are powerful. Others have been more powerful. They are not dangerous because they are numerous. Others have been more numerous. They are dangerous because they never stopped. They faced extinction by their own hand a dozen times and chose each time to survive. Not always wisely, not always cleanly, but persistently, stubbornly, collectively, and with a capacity for adaptation that no projections adequately captured because our models assume species either develop in orderly stages or collapse. These people did neither. They stumbled forward through every stage, carrying their contradictions with them, and emerged as something our models do not have a category for. They are not in our records because they were never looking for permission to exist. File accordingly." She sat back in her chair. The archive hummed around her, the same hum it had always had, 10,000 years of collected knowledge vibrating in the walls and floors and ceiling. She updated the threat classification. First contact, active diplomatic status. Then, after a moment's thought, she added one final line to the annotation, in small text, in the informal register, the way she wrote in her private journal. "And they make excellent coffee. The ambassador brought some. I don't know what we've been doing all this time." She closed the file. The galaxy continued, as it always had, vast and surprising, and not nearly as well catalogued as anyone had previously believed.